I am so happy to be back here, with the exception of the weather. That was a bit of a shock this morning. If you ask the general public about globalization, many would say that it is realized through free trade and capitalism. Nationalistic populism is rolling back this globalization now, evidenced by the Brexit vote in the UK, which affects me directly, and the election of Donald Trump in the US, which affects all of you directly, not to mention the popularity of Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. So Marine Le Pen in France and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. Despite the fact that Wilders did not win the election last week, we cannot lose sight of the fact that his party actually had the second highest number of seats. These are some Economist covers that are just from the past couple of months to show how timely and right globalization is as an issue. But this is only a partial understanding of what globalization is in terms of its definitions and rate of development. It is not linear, but it ebbs and flows. These covers actually come from 10 years ago. Globalization is more than just another way to describe connectivity, trade, migration, internationalism, or diffusion. There is often no consensus on the definition of globalization, although many characterize it. It is widely agreed that one of globalization's most defining features is increasing connectivity. Specifically, it is of a type that encompasses a wide-scale flow of ideas and knowledge alongside the sharing of cultural customs, civil society practices, and the environment. This may manifest itself through closer economic integration via increased movement of goods and services, capital and labor, and it may be shaped by politics. I'm a fan of The Economist, as you can tell. Many debate globalization's features, however, such as whether it is informed by technological changes, involves the reconfiguration of states, goes together with regionalization, or includes a sense of time-space compression. Usually, globalization is described and discussed within its experiential sphere, so that we hear of different kinds of globalization, such as financial, commercial, economic, or political. Most will agree, however, that globalization is uneven and asymmetric in pace, scope, and impact. There are clear ebbs and flows of various connectivities that work in tandem economically, socially, materially, and politically. Some understand these developments as a process, others as a system, and yet others as a discourse. John Tomlinson describes globalization simply as complex connectivity. Roland Robertson defines globalization as the process by which the world increasingly becomes seen as one place and the ways in which we are made conscious of that process. But this should not be taken to imply that there's a unified world society or culture. For this reason, Jan Nedderveen-Pieters defines globalization as a process of hybridization that gives rise to a global melange. And he argues that globalization can be understood as an open-ended synthesis of a number of disciplinary approaches to such developments, in which there are as many globalization modes as there are agents, dynamics, and impulses. I argue that globalization is more than just complex connectivity. I've defined globalization as processes of increasing connectivities that unfold and manifest as social awareness of those connectivities. That it is about the processes themselves makes globalization an active concept rather than a descriptive one. The idea suggests a world scale, which is why some argue it can be a phenomenon that begins only with the period in which we've had the means of global circumnavigation. But more often, the term is used to signal wider changes within a conceptual or experienced world. Most commonly, it involves increasing integration and cooperation with evolving, facilitating commonalities. An important corollary to the increasing senses of similarity and accessibility is the awareness and even development of more pronounced differences and inequalities with those not so closely integrated into the experiential sphere or not involved at all. This corollary indicates that there are two primary aspects of globalization processes. One is the development of shared practices and values that contribute to the sense of one-placeness, and these often derive from a variety of increasing connectivities. The other is burgeoning awareness of and sensitivity to differences, especially cultural ones. Growing awareness of cultural difference is a function of globalization, not just a feature of it. it manifests itself often as resurgence of local identities in explicit contrast to the increasingly shared practices of the globally connected level. That these local expressions of identity are also commonly linked to widely divergent levels of wealth, health, and political power often only serves to heighten such contrasts and the degrees of social investment in maintaining cultural difference. Thus, with globalization, there is a balance between shared practices that bind and diversities that distinguish participants. Indeed, cultural convergence cannot exist without cultural differentialism, since we cannot converge unless we start from divergence. The two are not only in tension with one another, but also interdependent. Together, they are part of the paradox of globalization. However, many discussions of globalization, both in the popular press and academia, pay lip service only to the former, the commonalities, and neglect the latter, the differences. Therefore, one could argue that what we are experiencing now in our own society, with the rise of populism and nationalism, and the rejection of international collaborations, is the jostling balance between global interaction and localized identities, practices, and beliefs. This is exemplified by the US pulling out of trade agreements, building metaphorical and actual walls, Britain's rejection of the European Union, and the appeal to many in Europe of Le Pen and Wilders. Justin Jennings identifies 8 trends that occur in contemporary globalization. They are overlapping and spurred by complex connectivity to create a global culture. He argues that all should be present for a period to be considered an era of globalization. The first is time-space compression. Identified by Harvey, this is experience of having one's world shrunk through the acceleration of long-distance economic, political, and social processes, such that changes in one place can have ramifications across a broad region. The internet is one such example that contributes to our own sense of time-space compression. The repercussions of the 2008 financial crisis across the Western world is another example. The introduction of a new pack animal or extension of a recording system had similar effects in the past. The second is deterritorialization. By this, I mean the sense that a place seems only tenuously connected to its local, geographically fixed context. This occurs often as a result of foreign influences on a variety of local practices. Cosmopolitanism is one effect of deterritorialization, especially in our so-called international cities around the globe. The global spread of companies like McDonald's, Starbucks, and the media like Hollywood and television promotes this. For the past, the quantity and variety of imported styles in certain eras promotes this, example of which I'll show you shortly. The third is standardization. This takes place as people navigate ways to bridge geographic and cultural divides. Universal measurement standards like Greenwich Mean Time or the metric system are examples today. For the past, administrative languages help promote standardization across vast territories made up of diverse cultural groups. The fourth is unevenness. Globalization is not an even process in terms of inclusiveness. Interregional interaction networks are not geographically ubiquitous, and so there can be substantial power differentials between engaged regions. Today, China dominates many exchange relationships, but other countries remain relatively isolated despite their involvement in global exchanges, such as Haiti. Bollywood enjoys global influence, whereas the Iranian film industry does not. For the past, this is seen in how one city may enjoy much wider influence than other sites in its era, and with patchiness in the spread of stylistic horizons. Again, I will show you an example of this shortly. The fifth is homogenization, perhaps the most widely discussed hallmark of globalization processes and the most reactive. As flows of ideas, objects, and people increase, a degree of cultural homogenization occurs as individuals come to rely on a similar suite of practices and products. This is seen in the spread of brands like McDonald's and Starbucks. For the past, this happens through conformity in practices between diverse groups, such as the use of similar objects and styles. The sixth is cultural heterogeneity. This occurs because, alongside increasing homogenization, cultural variation often increases at the same time, especially as practices get reinterpreted locally. The blending of outside influences with local practices varies from place to place. Thus, yoga gets reinterpreted in American studios, and hamburgers in Japan are not quite what we would recognize here. In the past, this is exemplified visually by ceramic variabilities that blend a number of ideas, again, which I will show you later. The seventh is the re-embedding of local culture. This might be seen as a resurgence of local practices and forms in explicit reaction to the homogenization promoted by increasing globalization. The Académie Française maintains the purity of the French language, for example. In the past, this is found in the reassertions of local traditions, such as burial forms, settlement organization, or other practices. Finally, the eighth is vulnerability. Complex connectivity leads to interdependence because of the numerous deeply embedded connections between various groups. Awareness of the risks of globalization become acute when an event reverberates across the network. The challenge facing Britain's decoupling from the European Union and the risk this is posing to the continued existence and success of the EU highlights the vulnerability of the complex connections that have been created by the globalized network that is the EU. In the past, when strong centers like Rome faltered, the globalized exchange system it had created around itself broke apart into smaller networks that operated on a more restricted scale. Jennings argues that all of these need to be present to have globalization. But what defines them as being present? Almost all of these 8 characteristics are, in fact, easy to find in the past in ways that are comparable with our experiences today, although one aspect is harder than others precisely because of how we experience this today, and this is the idea of time-space compression. The reason time-space compression is harder to identify in the past is because rarely did we have the technological developments we have today. This is one reason why the idea of globalization in the past is often contentious. Many scholars argue that it can only be a very modern phenomenon. Others suggest that it can only be from the 16th century and European circumnavigation of the globe, heralding the European age of discovery, but which gives Westernism a certain priority in our understanding of globalization. Time-space compression itself can be challenged by phenomenology, for the world is not physically shrinking or contracting as a result of globalization. The impression derives from the more rapid communication between groups, which has created the sense that the world is smaller, since it takes less time to communicate than it did previously. The cultural experience of globalization of most people is not derived from their own direct mobility. Since we are not actually experiencing time and space compressing, what is it that we are experiencing? One could argue that it is the sense of one-placeness. We can communicate with someone on the other side of the world in an instant, as if we are in the same place. Previously, the advent of the telephone made it possible to speak directly with someone far away. Long-distance networks of shipping routes, roads, and pathways served the same purpose in the more distant past. These all helped faraway places feel connected, just as the rapid communication does today. But there are other ways to convey this connection, this sense of one-placeness. In antiquity, the majority of people did not travel far, if at all. Instead, networks of shared practices conveyed this notion of one-placeness. In the Roman world, for instance, speed of travel and communication did not increase substantially across the Roman Empire when a region became incorporated into it, despite the construction of road networks. But there was increased frequency of communication, which led to increased information about regions, routes, and prices, as well as more regular movement of ideas and services. These resulted in widespread goods and practices, which created a sense of one-placeness. It is through the networks of practices and goods in common that individuals experience the sense of space and time compressing into one shared lived experience. So now let's look at the Mediterranean's Iron Age, the temporal focus of this evening's talk. First of all, when are we speaking about? Before I answer that, contrary to what one might think, the Iron Age is not strictly correlated to the development of ironworking. Iron was known in the 5th and 4th millennia BCE in Iran, Iraq, and Egypt, and in 3rd millennium Mesopotamia and Anatolia. It has been assumed that these very early sporadic examples were derived from meteoric iron, especially as Bronze Age Sumerian and Egyptian texts speak of iron from heaven, but Old Assyrian period texts refer to amitum and asium, interpreted as types of iron, perhaps to distinguish between meteoric and smelted, or bloom iron and iron ore. Smelted iron began to be produced somewhat less sporadically during the second half of the second millennium in Anatolia, Syro-Palestine, Cyprus, and Greece, but iron nevertheless remained rare and expensive and was confined primarily to ornamental and ceremonial or ritual objects, rather than military or utilitarian ones. And this is supported by Hittite texts that indicate that manufactured iron objects were used as commodities in gift exchanges between monarchs. There is also evidence from Anatolia, Jordan, and the Transjordan that steel began to be produced during the middle and late second millennium, which may refer to the so-called good iron specified in Hittite texts. By the 11th century BCE, iron appears in the Eastern Mediterranean more widely and in more diverse function, including weapons and tools, although it is not until the 10th century that iron may be regarded as in regular use, and for a range of ornamental, utilitarian, and military objects in diverse forms. The notion that an Iron Age follows a Bronze Age derives from the earliest ancient Greek works themselves. Notably, Hesiod, in his Works and Days, discusses the moral degradation of civilization over 5 successive ages of man, from gold to silver to bronze to heroic to iron. The origin of our modern progressions derive from the Danish antiquarian Christian Jørgensen Thomsen, who devised a chronological means of assessing the dates of artifacts using a 3-age system, stone, bronze, and iron, to establish a rough chronological sequence and seriation for Danish prehistory. Yet his Iron Age dates to between 400 BCE and 800 CE. The period I am speaking about pertains largely to the first half of the first millennium BCE. Iron Age, as a term, therefore, is in no sense an indicator of absolute chronology, across the Mediterranean or indeed elsewhere. Rather, it is best regarded as a means to mark changes with traditions and practices associated with the antecedents with which it is being compared. It is thus a relative term. What followed were changes in social practices, which we infer from material remains, primarily new ceramic shapes and styles, architectural forms, and burial practices. These changes did not occur in a single instance, but developed over time. Furthermore, the rate of development of any material category was not uniform from region to region, or even site to site. The concept, therefore, is entirely a relational one. For the Mediterranean, this break happens by the end of the 12th century BCE, which is considered the end of the Bronze Age. This brought about the final demise of the Mycenaean palace system in the Aegean, the disintegration of the Hittite Empire in Anatolia and Mesopotamia, the invasion of Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean coastline by the so-called Sea Peoples, and the end of Egypt's New Kingdom era. Widespread contacts between these communities became scarce, especially in comparison with the quantity of circulating goods, ideas, and individuals that both preceded and postdated the centuries around the turn of the first millennium BCE. And this is part of what creates a more general feeling of change. This characteristic marks the beginning of the Iron Age in the Mediterranean. But what characterizes the Mediterranean's Iron Age most is the movement of people, distinguished by numbers and nature. By the 9th century BCE, individuals and small groups began to move around the Mediterranean. Some of these were traders and craftsmen, but also we see the movement of larger groups of people who take up residence on foreign shores. The 2 such movements with the widest impact are by the Phoenicians and the Greeks. Despite the fact that both Phoenicians and Greeks founded overseas settlements across the Mediterranean, and sometimes in the same geographical territory, such as Sicily, study of their expansion has been divided between disciplines. Near Eastern scholars traditionally have focused on the Phoenician colonization process, while classical scholars examine the Greek movement. This disciplinary division may be traced to 19th century Western European scholarship and the respective primacy of ancient classical and biblical literary sources accorded by archaeological research in that era. For classical scholars, the works of Homer and subsequent ancient authors often served as the avenue for research and interpretation as early field archaeologists sought to justify the texts. The most famous examples are probably Schliemann's quest for Troy, especially the stratum associated with the Trojan War, and Evans's search for King Minos at Knossos. For Near Eastern scholars, the Bible alone served as the leading text, and many invested great effort and scholarship in trying to prove that the biblical tales recorded historical events and individuals. This can be summed up by the financial sponsor's view of the work at Samaria, carried out by Reisner, which was, and I quote, "to prosecute biblical, linguistic, archaeological, and other kindred studies and researches under more favorable conditions than can be secured at a distance from the Holy Land." Explicit study of the Greek and Phoenician colonial movements has maintained divided trajectories in scholarship, expressed with a sense of competition for primacy in colonial innovation ensuing between the two disciplines. Symptomatic of this rivalry has been questions over the dates of the earliest colonies, as if a kind of Mediterranean supremacy depended upon it. According to ancient literary sources, Phoenician expansion in the Mediterranean began in the 12th century BCE, while Greek colonization started only in the 8th century. Since the late 19th century, however, Greek-minded scholars have argued that Phoenician expansion could not have begun before the 8th century, for no material evidence could be identified to support such early foundations anywhere in the Mediterranean where the Phoenicians were supposed to have colonized. John Boardman, one of the leading scholars of Greek colonization, has maintained, and I quote, "It is only after the Greeks established themselves on the Syrian coast that Greece begins to receive and appreciate Eastern products, and there is no clear evidence for Phoenician trading colonies overseas earlier than the Greek ones. For all that, they may have been the carriers of what little did travel into the Greek world from the East before the 8th century. The nature of this trade did not require the establishment of regular trading posts or colonies until Greek example and competition led them to similar undertakings." Similar ideas continue to circulate among Greek colonization specialists. Gottschetz-Kladze has recently commented, "In the 8th century BC, Greeks were moving into the relatively close territories of central and southern Italy, whilst the Phoenicians established small settlements in Sardinia and further to the west and south. The Greek settlements were designed for permanence. Those of the Phoenicians disappeared over time, probably absorbed by the locals." This statement is narrow in focus and factually incorrect, for it overlooks the enduring Phoenician settlements of Sicily and North Africa and Spain, and contemporary Greek communities that failed to survive. Phoenician foundations were no less permanent than Greek ones. Discussion of a particular territory is often framed in terms of Greek or Phoenician priority without consideration of shared landscapes between one another or indeed anyone else, despite the fact that other groups were often quite happily already living in these areas where the Greeks and Phoenicians arrived. Sabatino Moscati, one of the first scholars to discuss in detail Phoenician expansion in the Mediterranean, argued almost defensively in his seminal work on this subject that the lack of material evidence earlier than the 8th century, which was the case until very recently, was no reason to doubt that Greek and biblical texts and Phoenician records that attest Phoenician activity far earlier. Pottery is our primary means of dating sites and contexts during this period. The problem with evidence for Phoenician settlement is that Phoenician pottery changes little in style over the late 2nd and early 1st millennium, and certainly lacks the very fine chronological precision of Greek pottery. So when Phoenician ceramic material is found, it is very difficult to say exactly when it dates to. Here's an example of the problem. Moscati regarded the famous bronze Melkart statuette from just off the coast of western Sicily as of Bronze Age date on general stylistic grounds, and therefore considered it indicative of Phoenician presence in Sicily well before the Greeks. I should add that others have dated this stylistically to the 7th century, so long after the Greeks and Phoenicians were established on the island. Nevertheless, in his quest for a Bronze Age date, and thus evidence for Phoenician activity in Sicily well before the Greeks, Moscati ignores the more extensive Mycenaean material, the example on the right, from the southern and eastern coasts of the island, and influences inland, where local pottery and metal production sometimes adopt Mycenaean forms or decorative motifs. Together, these suggest that the island was more engaged with Bronze Age Greece than Phoenicia. Having said this, recent excavations at the southern coastal site of Canatello have produced Bronze Age Cypriot wares alongside Mycenaean ones in habitation context, and late Cypriot Bronze Age pottery is known from grave contexts at Thapsos. So if this bronze statuette is Bronze Age in date, might it not have been part of a Mycenaean cargo, or perhaps a Cypriot one, rather than explicitly Phoenician, when there is no other material evidence of explicitly Phoenician activity? These are the kinds of nitty-gritty debates we fight over in Mediterranean Iron Age archaeology: chronology versus material evidence versus literary evidence. More convincingly Phoenician-derived is the presence of Near Eastern metalwork in 10th century contexts at Greek settlements such as Lefkandi and Knossos. From the 9th century, resident or itinerant Phoenician craftsmen on Rhodes, Crete, Athens, Lefkandi, and Kos have been argued for by many. This 9th century period has been described by Niemeyer as a Phoenician merchant venturers phase in the Mediterranean, whereby craftsmen, traders, prospectors, and agents traverse the sea in full knowledge of one another and their customers, and one that firmly predates permanent Phoenician settlement on foreign shores. This also acts as a very precise parallel to Greek pre-colonial activity that is often argued for, to take into account the presence of Greek pottery in overseas contexts that predate the foundation of Greek colonies in that region. These difficulties have developed because of a reliance on literary evidence as historical fact. Ancient sources say that the Phoenicians were traveling in the Mediterranean as early as the 12th century, but we can't find them. The problem is that these records were written hundreds of years later by authors with their own agendas for audiences in their own era. They were never intended as accurate historical records of fact. The case of Thapsos ware in Sicily represents an excellent example of the danger of using literary sources to guide interpretation. For generations, Thucydides provided the chronology most widely adopted for the foundation of the Greek colonies in Sicily, with Naxos as the first foundation in 734 BCE, closely followed by Syracuse the following year, and then Megara Heblaea in 728. Thucydides' authority was upset in the 1950s by the publication of a class of pottery from Megara Heblaea that appeared to be about a generation older than anything known from Syracuse. This class is now recognized as Thapsos ware, a product of Corinth in Greece. To explain this anomaly, the excavators of Megara Heblaea turned to the chronology offered by the chronographer Eusebius, who indirectly places the foundation of Megara Heblaea at around 750 BCE. So that nicely represents a generation earlier. And this was in the 1950s that this pottery was first discovered. In the late 1970s, near identical and thus accepted as contemporary Thapsos ware was discovered at Syracuse, and the arguments for an earlier foundation date for Megara Heblaea were withdrawn. One needs to be careful about the date of sources you're reading, because this debate rages in works between the 1950s and the 1970s over whose chronology is correct. Now, while all of this might be a very minor note in the debate about source primacy, its repercussions could have been far more substantial, for the significance of this particular debate rests in the fact that the very tight seriation of Corinthian pottery was established from the material found in these substantial and well-preserved cemeteries of Syracuse and Megara Heblaea. Our entire understanding of the Corinthian sequence of pottery comes from Sicily for this era. Corinthian pottery was the primary Greek ware to travel overseas, and it traveled everywhere in abundance. As a result, it has often been used as the means of dating the context of its find spots, which extended everywhere. I myself have used Corinthian pottery to date contexts on the Syrian border of Turkey. So the placement of the foundation of Megara Heblaea 20 years before that of Syracuse would have required the entire Corinthian seriation and chronology to be reconsidered and adjusted accordingly. The potential repercussions would have been massive, affecting anyone dealing with 7th century context in the Mediterranean and beyond. This example is indicative of the fundamental features of this period, which is the widespread use of Greek material culture forms, particularly ceramics and urban architectural features. Almost everywhere the Greeks settled, Their wine and associated drinking wares quickly became integrated with local tastes and customs, and their ceramic assemblages influenced regional indigenous outputs. In addition, many settlements adopted Greek-derived architectural forms. Even more than that, the Greek alphabet, which you really can't see very well in that on the far right there, but the Greek alphabet was adapted to express local languages, even though Greek itself originally derived from the Phoenician. And many indigenous communities borrowed the Greek system of coinage. While the Phoenicians were just as prevalent in the Mediterranean, their material culture was not as widely adopted by others. Greek ceramic use and architectural ideas were also incorporated by the Phoenicians into their practices and urban constructions. Initially, this prevalence of Greek cultural forms was interpreted as a craving for cultural enlightenment and sophistication by indigenous communities, and the Phoenicians to a certain extent, who were pretty much ignored because they were part of Near Eastern archaeology. This is best summed up by Boardman's description of Greek interaction with the non-foreign populations of Sicily and Italy when he says, "In the West, the Greeks had nothing to learn, much to teach." We called this Hellenization. In the Hellenization model, the Greeks maintain cultural, social, political, and economic superiority. They remain immune from any such influence by those who were Hellenized. In this model, the non-Greeks adopted Hellenic culture wholesale and unquestioningly. There is little consideration of agency or reciprocity. Hellenization is therefore a binary, unidirectional process. And this interpretation dominated our views for much of the 20th century, from the interwar period, when Greek colonies were considered glorious counterparts to Europe's own colonial holdings, even while they were disintegrating. By the early 1990s, archaeology began to be influenced by the postmodern deconstruction that had been taking place in wider Western intellectual discourse during the 1980s, especially the emergence of post-colonialism through the works of Said and Spivak. As post-colonialism began to emerge as a counter-narrative, or as a means to deconstruct the meta-narratives of colonial discourse, archaeological scholarship began to reconsider their interpretations of Greek and Roman colonizations. And they began to look at the archaeological data more closely, and irregularities in the patterns began to emerge. My own research in the 1990s is part of this, in which I examined the impact of Greek colonization in Sicily, but from the Sicilian perspective, something that was novel at the time, as Greek colonization previously had been studied just from the Greek colonial perspective. My early research discovered a number of instances where wholesale adoption was not evident, but rather it was much more selective. So while I did find considerable evidence of the adoption of certain drinking and pouring shapes, such as you see on the left, by the indigenous communities of southeastern Sicily, they had no interest at all in the vessels that you see on the right. So on the lower right is a crater, a mixing bowl. The sickles of southeastern Sicily were not interested in mixing their wine. And initially this was interpreted as a poor performance of the Greek symposium. I argued that maybe we should be looking at it in the terms of the sickles' own performance, that the materials that they chose accorded with their own practices and traditions. They didn't mix their wine, they didn't need a wine mixing bowl. But more interesting was their rejection of those small flasks that you see at the top, which is called an araballos. It's a small perfume flask. Now, this was a product of the Greeks. We know that the Greeks had them and had them in abundance because our entire understanding of the typological development of the araballos comes from the thousands that were excavated in the graves of Syracuse and Megara Hyblaea in Sicily. And yet, the sickles, the Sicilian populations living around Syracuse and Megara Hyblaea, had absolutely no interest in them whatsoever. Not a single one was found in a grave pertaining to the 8th and 7th centuries. We know that the Greeks were very happy to sell these, though, because in southern Italy, indigenous communities used them, buried them in their graves, and in central and western Sicily, the indigenous communities there, the Sicans, the Elymians, were very happy to use them and bury them. The sickles in eastern Sicily made an active decision not to use these vessels. They didn't have a perfume flask in their own repertoire. They had no need for it. They didn't take it. I argued that these were examples of agency, making choices for themselves. Interpretations such as these were regarded as evidence of hybridization, of which I give you some animal examples. This thinking emerged very much in the 1990s in archaeological scholarship. The idea of a hybrid culture refers to a melange evolving from practices of mixed origins and finds its origin in biological concepts. Homi Bhabha drew upon the idea to deconstruct the dualistic perception of colonial situations that perpetuated notions of colonizer and colonized, or colonial versus indigenous. When connected to cultural practice, hybridization may be regarded as the cultural mixture that arises from the practices of mixed origins. People and material objects in such situations reflect more than just a mixture of cultural similarities and differences, for the negotiations between cultural and indigenous traditions create new social and material practices. Often such developments will comply with colonial standards and maintain traditional perceptions in a milieu that is unique to the group in question and ambivalent towards the colonial or indigenous norms. Hybridization is thus an active process related to the social agents and their negotiations and interactions in culture contact situations, but they must be regarded in the specifics of the local context in which it develops. Many have complained about the semantics of the notion of the word hybrid, that its biological origins, in which hybrid offspring are usually sterile, is contrary to the metaphorical implication, that only two parents can be the originators, whereas in its socio-cultural usage, many groups may contribute to the development to hybrid development, and also that it implies passivity and that it denotes a fusion of traits, whereas the process is often more selective and compartmentalized. Cultures are constantly evolving, and so are the meanings behind the use of artifacts. So the idea of sterility is a false one. It has also been argued that every culture is already hybrid because of their constant evolution and external influences. Some postmodernists question even whether our understanding of culture can ever be objective if culture is a construction of the observer. Furthermore, not all developments are necessarily hybrid. The context in which such changes occur, changes that are active choices made by individuals and groups who participate in social engagements with others on any level, are fundamental to understanding the nature of such manifestations. On the other hand, post-colonially inspired interpretations of the Iron Age Mediterranean that focus upon the experiences of the colonized have sometimes been accused of being nothing more than examples of political correctness. In the 1999 edition of The Greeks Overseas, John Boardman wonders if the recent emphasis on the experiences of the colonized is merely part of a, and I quote, thrusting of the desired modern standards onto antiquity and making assumptions about the prejudices of recent generations of scholars. He is not alone to have expressed this. These criticisms reflect a dissatisfaction with the change of emphasis because the result appears to write out the colonizer from the narrative. This is not really the case, however. Post-colonial works have never denied that colonial cultures had profound impact upon the so-called colonized. Rather, post-colonial discourse sought explicitly to emphasize the acts of agency on the part of the colonized, and to highlight that the changes that ensued in local populations were far more nuanced than direct or wholesale adoption of colonial ways of life. In fact, often the result was the development of hybrid cultures that shared elements of both traditions. Indeed, colonial cultures themselves were also hybrid. The previous narratives, on the other hand, were not concerned so extensively with these aspects. They focused instead on the spatial and temporal spread of Phoenician and Greek artifacts, and by association culture, continuing in the culture historical tradition. As a result, discussion of colonial impact was often superficially examined and widely generalized, which had given rise to concepts like Romanization and Hellenization in the first place. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, deconstruction of the Hellenization framework of interpretation had taken two clear and distinct trajectories. The first was an emphasis on the diversities of being Greek. This is seen in the destruction of the notion that Greek colonies were replicas of their mother cities. Instead, scholars have emphasized their diversities. In turn, this has also led to the deconstruction of the concept of the Greeks as a cultural unity, although there remain a sufficient number of common characteristics that we are still able to discuss a collective notion of Greeks. The second emphasis has been on articulating the role of the so-called native indigenous populations in the Greek-native relationship. Here, this has seen the breakdown of generalizations about the communities the Greeks came into contact with, especially in regard to their use of Greek material culture forms, noted particularly in pottery styles, architectural building plans, and subsequently in terms of burial customs and the use of written language. Studies in these fields have demonstrated that the use of any of these features were not instantaneous, but gradual, and that only selective aspects of Greek material culture were adapted, and always in a manner appropriate to the local circumstances. As a result, Hellenization as a means of understanding the nature of these developments fell very much out of favor. The best Phoenician example of this paradigm shift is seen in interpretations of the role of the Tophet, defined open-air ritual precincts where child sacrifice and infant burial took place as part of Phoenician religious practices. The bones were placed in urns in the precinct. The majority of Tophets come from beyond the Phoenician homeland. They've been found mostly in Western colonies, although examples from the Near East beyond Phoenician territories have been identified. Traditionally, it has been assumed that these reflect homeland practices, despite no Tophet having yet been discovered in communities in the Phoenician homeland. Moscati, for instance, notes, "There is no evidence of these sacred places actually in Phoenicia, but there is no doubt that they existed if we add to the biblical evidence the ample proof provided by excavations in the Western colonies." Today, however, more nuanced approaches recognize variability with regard to the Tophet that may have more significance for regional circumstances. The word never appears in Phoenician or Punic documentation. Our understanding of the function and significance of what we call Tophets in Phoenician and Punic contexts, therefore, is entirely etic. It was a sanctuary, like others, where people could have transactions with the gods. There was tremendous variability in burial and commemoration methods in Tophet contexts, however. Recent analysis reveals that social prestige is emphasized in the placement of stelae. The presence of a Tophet itself is also associated with other characteristics of urbanization to such an extent that it may be regarded as the first expression of the urban character of the settlement, where it served both the civic and territorial communities. In sum, current thinking is that the Tophet is a general label for different archaeological and conceptual realities across the Phoenician world, rather than a distinctly Phoenicio-Punic element. As Joe Crawley Quinn recently observed pithily, if there was a corporate Western Phoenician or Punic diaspora culture, the Tophet sanctuaries were not part of it. For the last 10 years or so, I've turned to globalization theories as a means of rehabilitating these various sets of evidence, the shared practices that gave rise to notions like Hellenization in the first place, the variability in practice of being Greek or Phoenician, and the resurgence of local practices in the face of the spread and impact of Hellenic and Phoenician cultures. But can we really speak of a globalized Mediterranean Iron Age? Let's return to those 8 criteria of globalization and see if we can identify them in the Mediterranean at this time, connected by networks of Greek and Phoenician colonies that bridged north and south, east and west. First, you will recall by now, of course, we have time-space compression, as the experience of having one's world shrunk through the acceleration of long-distance economic, political, and social processes. For the Mediterranean Iron Age, I would argue that we do have a sense of time-space compression facilitated by the networks of Greek and Phoenician settlements around the Mediterranean. These enabled communication across these respective communities to be rapid via a mix of long-distance and localized, more cabotage sailing, and which resulted in the widespread circulation of goods. The second is deterritorialization. This is the sense that a place seems only tenuously connected to its local geographically fixed context. For the past, the quantity and variety of imported styles in certain eras promotes this. Over the course of the 9th and 8th century, the quantity and varieties of items in circulation around the Mediterranean, in more than just elite contexts, suggests the evolution of trade. Wine, oils, metals, and ceramics are the most obvious material items, but other goods that do not leave such an obvious archaeological footprint include textiles, foodstuffs, and even slaves. It is perhaps with pottery most of all that we see this, however, My example of Thapsos ware and Corinthian pottery highlights that. Greek and Phoenician settlements around the Mediterranean began to produce their own pottery styles, albeit derived from their imported cultural repertoire. Thus, in Sicily, we see the advent of Sikeliot, Sicilian Greek pottery, which borrowed from Corinthian, Attic, and East Greek traditions. That's the example on the left. In France, we see the development of colonial creamware and gray monochrome ware, which are hidden in the picture on the right, the former of which became Massalia's standard tableware. The Phoenicians of Sardinia, Sicily, Malta, and Carthage shared a regional production koine that was mostly derivative of Eastern Mediterranean forms, but that always included a very fixed set of shapes. Features of colonial Greek wares were incorporated into indigenous productions. In Sicily, for example, Sicilian communities rapidly adopted the use of the trefoil inochoe. That is the shape of the vessel that you see in front of you. Sicilian trefoil inochoe of the 6th and 5th centuries, which are on the left in black and white, continued to use motifs derived from 7th century imports, which are these. So these are 6th and 5th century, still doing the same kind of motifs from the 7th century, rather than the contemporary, is my arrow showing? Excellent. Rather than the contemporary motifs that the Greek colonies themselves produced and imported. The third is standardization. This takes place as people navigate ways to bridge geographic and cultural divides. Universal measurements, as I've mentioned before, like Greenwich Mean Time and the metric system, remind us of this in the past. Remind us of this today, but for the past, administrative languages help promote standardization. So one of the most striking features of the first millennium BCE is the dissemination of the Greek alphabet across the Mediterranean. Derived from the Phoenician alphabet at the end of the 9th century, early extant examples of the Greek alphabet are often to do with a sense of ownership through single letters, dedicatory inscriptions, and possessive graffiti. It is not appropriate to think of this as literacy, since literacy requires both reading and writing skills. In the ancient world, these skills might not necessarily have been mastered by the same person. Social emphasis was on the importance of oral agreements and witnesses rather than the production of written documents, although they did exist. The skills of literacy, therefore, were in the hands of the few. The material context of inscriptions themselves further suggests that writing served more diverse social purposes beyond linguistic communication. With this in mind, the spread of writing to non-Greeks and non-Phoenicians must be regarded within the social realm. In Sicily, Greek script is first adopted during the 6th century by local populations to express spoken dialects, and usually follows the form of the nearest Greek settlement. Thus, communities around Etna used the script common at Catania, while those in the Hyblaean hills and around the Catania plain chose the variant of nearby Syracuse and Megara Hyblea. Greek Gela provided the alphabetic model for those settlements in its central Sicily hinterland, while Selinus did much the same for the surrounding communities in western Sicily. Phoenician, used by Phoenician settlements in Sicily from the 6th century, was not adopted by others. The inscriptions are often little more than brief expressions of ownership or greeting, etched onto drinking cups, suggesting a relationship between wine consumption and writing, the inscription perhaps enhancing the status of the owner. Greek becomes a language of official communication in Sicily only by the 4th century. In France, at Lattes, Etruscan was used from the 6th century and Greek from the middle of the 5th, but neither was adapted more widely to express local dialects until several centuries later, and then it was Greek. The Ionian form of the Greek alphabet, used in Massalia, was eventually adopted by lower Rhone basin communities to express their Celtic dialect in marking funerary and votive personal property, but only from the end of the 3rd century BCE. This exemplifies the constantly evolving, hybridizing nature of the era. Rather than outright adoption of the Greek alphabet and its functions, the use of these letters were modified to fit with local values and procedures. The long evolution of their adaptation also suggests that emulation is not the aim. In sum, the nature and extent of the use of Greek and/or the Greek alphabet beyond Greek colonial settlements depends more on local historical circumstances determined by the particulars of the settlement and its regional connections and interactions, rather than any general pattern or rate of linguistic development or even sense of Hellenization. The fourth is unevenness, and I would just like to draw your attention to a board game that is dedicated to the Mediterranean Iron Age. If anyone can get a copy of this for me, I would be very grateful. As noted already, interregional interaction, I think it must be a bit like Risk of the Mediterranean Iron Age. As noted already, interregional interaction networks are not geographically ubiquitous, and so there can be substantial power differentials between engaged regions. For the past, this is seen in how one city may enjoy much wider influence than other sites of its era, and with patchiness in the spread of stylistic horizons. No single city-state emerged as all-powerful until the 6th and 5th centuries, with the consolidation of Carthage as the Phoenician power base after the destruction of Tyre by the Babylonians in the early 6th century, and Athens' emergence as a political and economic force to be reckoned with by the 5th. Nevertheless, one could argue that the networks themselves of Greek and Phoenician settlements created collective power that enabled Athens and Carthage to emerge as focal points to consolidate power and fiscal success through their respective trading networks. The fifth is homogenization. The widespread use of Greek pottery and Greek architectural forms is what gave rise to Hellenization in the first place, so I'm not going to dwell on that. The sixth is cultural heterogeneity, and this is exemplified by ceramic variabilities that blend a number of ideas. Here's another ceramic example. Here we go. Here's another ceramic example, and this is a crater from Sabucina, an indigenous site in central Sicily. So by the 6th century, they weren't objecting to the craters quite so much. The decoration on this, where's my arrow? Come back arrow. The decoration on this right here is a pair of wild animals on either side in a frieze, and this is reminiscent of Middle Corinthian heraldic animal processions, but without the filling ornaments such as these. That's the tail, not a filling ornament. So no filling ornaments here, but same style as these Corinthian examples. They also don't use incision. I've put this on to show incision, although I'm not sure it's very clear. They also don't use incision, which is also typical of Greek products of that era. The color of the clay, this is the closest color image, imitates Corinthian pottery, but the shape, especially the foot, is closer to Attic forms. While imports to the Greek colony of Gela and Gela's own ceramic output may have served as inspiration, the local artist at Sabucina created a new, distinctly local juxtaposition of ideas. The seventh is the re-embedding of local culture. In the past, this is found in reassertions of local traditions, such as burial forms, settlement organization, and other practices. Waiting for my arrow. Come back arrow. Okay, so using Sicily as my example again, traditional domestic architecture before the Iron Age was the circular house, as you can see in this site here. I will say that the rectangular structures here are from different periods, so this particular plan shows various architectural levels. So in its earlier days, it was entirely circular forms. In Sicily during the 6th century, a number of Sicilian sites adopted urban forms that involved blocks articulated along large and narrow streets, rectilinear architecture, and encircling city walls, features associated with Greek and Phoenician urban environment. So it's notable that during the 6th century, a number of indigenous centers, while having embraced rectilinear architecture, as you can see on the right-hand side, what is in bold are all the same period, circular architecture in the traditional form was also used. But this example from Sabucina has this oddity here, which is in fact a vestibule in antis, the entrance to which is flanked by two columns to create an inner area of the portico, what we call a pronaos. This is, again, a unique juxtaposition of Sicilian tradition and architectural developments that derive from the Greek world. It adheres to the circular traditional forms, but now these buildings are being used for communal religious purposes. And this is in keeping with current Sicilian practice. But it also adopts the notion of a pronaos from Greek religious structures. Finally, the eighth is vulnerability. Complex connectivity leads to interdependence because of the numerous deeply embedded connections between various groups. The globalized system created by the networks of Greeks and Phoenicians caught up the local populations in their conflicts with one another. By the 6th century, with the destruction of Tyre in the eastern Mediterranean, Carthage took a more overtly active political role in the central Mediterranean, emerging as the focal point for Phoenician civilization. This is the dawn of the Punic era of Phoenician history. And this began in Sicily, when Carthage secured control over the Phoenician cities of western Sicily. This drew Greeks and Carthaginians into direct conflict with one another, with the local indigenous populations getting caught up in the conflict themselves, as they allied with one another to gain territorial control themselves. In conclusion, it can be argued that we have all the hallmarks of modern globalization in the first millennium BCE. But it is perhaps better to speak about it as a globalizing era rather than a globalized one. It is clear from the long-term trajectory the past provides that the development of globalization in the Mediterranean Iron Age was an uneven process, uneven temporally and spatially. It took a good 400 years from the 9th to the 5th century for these complex connectivities to develop fully. These processes began when the Greeks and Phoenicians created physical network infrastructures bound by common culture through their colonies, and used them to expand commercial enterprise and exert political influence. Through their mercantile networks, ideas about artistic and architectural forms spread, and mechanisms for facilitating communication became adopted and adapted. This created a sense of time-space compression through the one-placeness of globalization. But these adaptations were patchy in their adoption over time and across place. Nevertheless, a globalization perspective allows us to rehabilitate two key data sets in the discussion of the nature of Greek and Phoenician colonization: the widespread use of Greek ceramics and architectural forms, which gave rise to the Hellenization model in the first place, and the variability within such usage, which fostered interpretations that favored hybridization, both in terms of the variability of practice between the Greek colonies themselves and between Phoenician colonies themselves, for similar patterns within Phoenician colonial cultural development took place as well. A globalized perspective also allows the Phoenicians and the Greeks to be rehabilitated together into the archaeological narrative of the Mediterranean. The activities of the Phoenicians and their interactions with the Greeks and others in the Mediterranean are just as much an integral aspect to understanding the Greek-non-Greek relationship as the Greeks are to Phoenician cultural development in the Mediterranean. Other interpretive frameworks simply cannot account for this. Thus, globalization enables us to examine the balance between the shared traits that enable us to discuss the Greeks and the Phoenicians, while at the same time acknowledging the differences in the practices of being Greek or Phoenician. We can also recognize the tension found in the shared practices between different cultural groups and the articulations of their social identities that stand in contrast to the commonalities borne by wider engagement. This is part of the essence of globalization. The Mediterranean Iron Age as a globalized space, incorporating sets of shared practices and sharply defining differences that articulate local identities, is much more than a collection of decentered communities connected by mobile individuals or groups. The networks that create the sense of connectedness are central to that connectedness. An individual or even group may have different identities that are appropriate for different social, cultural, or even life stage contexts. It is the networks linking the actors that help us to untangle these multiple connections. While some of these networks bind people together through common goods and ideas to create a sense of one-placeness we identify with globalization, the network connections can also be used to differentiate groups from others, especially those outside a particular network. Ultimately, it is the expression of social identities through the use of material culture that underpins human connectivity. In short, the widely shared common characteristics that developed across the Mediterranean during the Iron Age do not reflect Hellenization or Phoenicianization, but broadly understood Mediterraneanizations, tempered by strongly articulated localized identities. For this reason, a globalization approach creates a far richer understanding of the social complexities that evolved during the Iron Age across the Mediterranean than we have ever been able to appreciate before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamara. I hope you'll be happy to take some
Absolutely.
questions. So, please.
What I found missing in your introductory remarks on globalization was any reference to the fact that modern globalization is, in the same way that colonization characterized the Mediterranean in the past, is really Westernization. If you look at architecture, Shanghai is not characterized by pagodas. It's got Western Dubai's, not ziggurats, and whatever. Clothing, I mean, even music. Over 30 years ago, I was in China. I was climbing a sacred mountain in the middle of nowhere, although, I mean, a lot of people there. We got to the top. There were these little kiosks selling knickknacks, so on. Some of them were selling music. And one of them, he's playing the Rolling Stones and the Beatles 30 years ago. And these were common people buying these things. So the whole character of globalization today, in my opinion, is very strongly Western. And yet the countries that have globalized have maintained, as the countries you described in the Mediterranean in the past, their own character. They've maintained their own culture, despite this hegemony of neo-colonial Westernization. So I think that would strengthen your argument, because I think there are real parallels between what happened in the Mediterranean during the Phoenician, Greek, and Roman eras and what is happening today in the world with the dispersion of Western culture.
I don't disagree with that, but I did only have an hour.
Right.
So no, I mean, absolutely. And often globalization is taken as proxy for Westernization. There are critiques on that as well, though.
Oh, I know.
And so, I mean, that in itself could become a whole other lecture, but I am extremely aware of that debate, and you are quite right to raise that point.
Other questions?
The whole time I was listening to you talk about time-space compression, I had in my mind one of my favorite maps, which appears in Spring Brubank's Making of the Middle Sea, where he has, it's just an outline map of the Mediterranean, but it's been rubber sheeted, as it were, to take account of, travel times and travel technology and so on, which spread, maritime communication, which spread at very different rates in different parts of the Mediterranean. So in this map, which, as I recall, represents his imagining of the state of affairs towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC or beginning of the 2nd. So, the whole of Egypt and the Levant and Cyprus and southern Turkey is squished into this tiny little area, and then it gets a little bit bigger in the Aegean and Greek world, and then in the west it's huge, right? It's a very peculiar looking map, but I think very evocative, and that is reflective of what we know about the the advances in maritime communicative technology. Where we've got Nile boats, coming out of the Nile and into the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Byblos boats famously, but at the same time, this is in the later 4th and 3rd millennium, but at the same time in the Aegean, as Brubank himself laid out very, very clearly in his first big book, we're dealing with essentially fleets of high-speed, paddle-driven longboats, right, involved in raiding and trading. And in the Western Mediterranean, something much more primitive that's keeping peoples much further apart from each other in terms. So in other words, there's great differentials over time in the degree of time-space compression, which, if we're talking about the Mediterranean, has to be largely, I think, thought about in terms of maritime technologies of communication. And it seems to me that it's really only in the late stages of the 2nd millennium BC that we've got, plank-built, keeled, masted sailing ships plying the whole of the Mediterranean for the first time, including the West. And that's really the inception point of the story that you've been telling this evening. I mean, does that sound right to you, broadly?
To a certain extent, yes. I think, yes. I mean, it's not just the ships, but it's the routes. It's where those ports have now been established. That creates a much more dense network of opportunities in the Iron Age than existed in the Bronze Age. And so yes, while I agree with what you say about the significance and importance of maritime abilities, It's on such a greater scale in the Iron Age that it's really remarkable. But yes, I do agree with what you're saying.
Anyone else a question or yes? Okay.
Well, I think one of the things that I got out of hearing you develop this in the whole Iron Age situation versus the way you laid it out in the book, for example, is this concept of getting together with the time-space, shrinking that goes on in an episode of Globalization. Is that I liked how you approached it also from the phenomenological point of view, and you said that this is something that doesn't actually have to be. Of course, we need the real connections, we need the real boats, we need the real increase the amount of connectivity within one of these periods to validate a globalization, era. But it can be a phenomenologically felt experience, and that really matters to me. For example, if you're an island and you're living in a port city, it's a completely different experience than whether you're in the middle of Sicily somewhere. And I think that people can still feel connected and still feel the change in connectivity that globalization brings, even if they're not in a port, if they can phenomenologically experience it in such a way. And I think with the examples of the ribelloid that you showed, for example, that we see in a port and we cannot see it, in an interior site, you can see that people are probably experiencing that and then making conscious, active choices based on their feeling of being global or not wanting to be global.
Exactly.
And that is going to be predicated then on their local situation in that village that they're in, whether it's on an island close to a port or not. These are the choices they're making, but they will still be affected by the increased connectivity of those periods. So one thing I really liked was the phenomenological approach. I think that definitely happens, and you don't need to leave that village necessarily and get on that boat to be feeling globalization. So that may tie into the mountaintop idea as well, but I think that's something that you can really add from your approach.
Thank you. I mean, that's the phenomenological. I've struggled with the whole time-space compression because, of course, we really don't have that same kind of technological advancement that we have today that really makes us feel that time-space compression. And that's why I've had to think through phenomenologically, what is it that creates that sense? Most of our connections around the world are through Facebook. We're not actually going around the world to see our friends there. So we're still experiencing it from the comfort of our own room, and yet we feel globally connected. So how are we experiencing that? And that's where the phenomenology comes in. So I think the two balance out. You need the connections, you need those maritime connections to move those goods around, but then the goods are there, it's how you use them, and even though you're not necessarily somebody going, the traders are bringing it to you, you can still feel part of this wider world. Exactly.
And we can see that if you look at a lot of ancient sources as well. Now you can say some of them are biased and some of them, aren't really completely representative of the situation. But when people talk about frogs around a pond,
Yep.
and people talk about, look at Strabo and he says, oh, here are all the islands in the Roman Sea. It's like they're miniaturizing everything and they can see it in one page. So they do have that sense that they're part of something bigger.
I will say one of the things I have tried to do is actually step back from the tyranny of the sources in this, because that's what actually drove apart these two very different trajectories of Greek studies, Phoenician studies, different disciplines, Near Eastern, classical archaeology, led by sources. And what I'm trying to do is actually rehabilitate these two disciplines into a global narrative, a Mediterranean-wide narrative that breaks down these ideas. In the West, the Greeks had nothing to learn, much to teach, and nothing to do with the Phoenicians, who were just kind of hanging around there anyway. Because if you look at it from the Phoenician scholarship perspective, everything that Greek scholars have said about Greek colonies, it's the same things are happening, the same discussions and analyses are going on, and yet the two disciplines don't really talk to each other. And my aim is to help make those two disciplines communicate with each other and help others learn about both disciplines together instead of having to troll through two entire sets of scholarship.
Ian,
This is
final
something
comment?
kind of nuts, but how? With the movement of goods and things going around, and this phenomenological engagement with a globalizing sort of interact. The movement of things. That doesn't necessarily need to be real, though, in the sense of.
Wait, what doesn't need to be real?
That phenomenological, engagement. I'm thinking about John Mandeville and Prester John and all the things. I mean, the movement of goods and people, even, for instance, in the High Middle Ages, produces a sense of globalization that isn't real. It's entirely fictitious.
Experiential.
Yeah, and yet it's based on real things and the movement of real things and real people. And so, I mean, how do you think that you would...
Phenomenology comes back into this, though.
Yeah, or engage with that.
It's on its own local terms. That's the thing. There isn't, you can't, you know, I'm talking about globalization. One word fits the whole Mediterranean there. But actually, when you have to analyze it on that very local scale, because it will differ from site to site, place to place, context to context, precisely because it's conditioned by what's going on locally. Who are your neighbors? What are the political issues? And that's going to be different from the other side of the island or somewhere else across the mountain. So it needs to be considered in multiple scales at the same time. On the one hand, we have these shared sets of practices that bind us at the global level, but we also have these local identities, local identities down here, connected by the networks that both connect and divide. Because if you're not part of that network, you're out of that network. So we think of networks as producing connectivity, but networks also prevent it by virtue of excluding some people. So trying to keep all those different scales in mind in our interpretation of whatever single context it is. So I hope that this framework helps people, frees people to be creative in their interpretations, to try to understand it as close as we can from the perspective of those who are living it.
I think that's a great note to end the discussion on. And as you were speaking, I was thinking, well, I'm glad our networks have entangled you to bring you here in person and not through Facebook, and that we've been enjoying your talk here, and that we can continue some discussions over a glass of wine or soft drink. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.